On the plains of ancient Iran, 3,000 years ago, a single voice rang out to challenge the old gods and proclaim a new vision of truth. That was the voice of Zoroaster, also known as Zarathustra, the reformer and prophet who founded one of the world's oldest monotheistic faiths. His ideas, a single wise god, a cosmic struggle between good and evil, and a crescendo of a final judgment, echo through history, and of course have influenced later religions. But who exactly was Zoroaster? That remains a fascinating puzzle to solve. Little's known for certain about his life, shrouded as mystery as it is in myth and time. But what we'll try to do today is explore Zoroaster's story from his legendary birth and early struggles as much as we can tell it. We'll go through his teachings and philosophy, and then we'll finish off talking about his lasting impact. We'll journey through chronologically in this video, grounding our narrative in the closest sources to the time, and of course, we'll be looking at them critically and examining their reliability. I think by the end you'll see how a Bronze Age priest from Persia became a towering figure in world religious history. But allow me to welcome you to the channel. Where are my manners? They're right here. Hello everyone, and it's good to meet any newcomers. If you've not done so yet, I invite you to hit the subscribe button and perhaps tell me where you're listening from down in the comments. It's always interesting to see the breadth of reach that this channel gets. So with that being said, let's all get nice and relaxed. Now we can begin the life of Zoroaster, as much as we can tell it. And so with introductions out of the way, we know exactly where and somewhat when Zoroaster was born. But to understand Zoroaster, we first need to picture the context of the world that he was born into. Ancient Iran, at a time when the region's people followed an old Indo-Iranian religion. This was a polytheistic faith with many gods, we're talking deities of sun, moon, fire, etc., ritual sacrifices, and even an interesting sacred intoxicant called halma. Society was largely pastoral and nomadic, pretty normal for the time. People tended to herd cattle and camels on the steppes of Central Asia. Zoroaster himself grew up in a pastoral culture. Notably, his very name is actually linked to camels. In the old Iranian language, Avestan, Ustra, actually means camel. That's an interesting little fact for you. Of course, this all hints that camels were certainly important in his community's life. The young Zoroaster, or Zarathustra, as he called himself in his own language, was born into the Spitama clan, a family of priests. His father was Poroshaspa, and his mother, Dugadova. As a boy, Zoroaster would have been taught the traditional rituals and hymns of his time. In fact, evidence from Zoroaster's own hymns, the Gathas, suggests he became a Zautar or priest. Thus he was educated in religious rites and lore from a very early age. So when and where did Zoroaster live? Of course, one of the first puzzles is pinning down when Zoroaster lived. Now, we did say 3,000 years ago, but you got to take that with a bit of grain of salt. Historians and ancient sources do not agree on this date. Later religious traditions in Persia, recorded centuries after his life, by the way, claimed that Zoroaster lived 258 years before Alexander the Great, and that would place him around 600 BC, since Alexander the Great conquered Persia in 330 BC. This would make him a contemporary of the later Persian kings. However, a lot of people today find this date to be somewhat unlikely. Linguistic clues in Zoroaster's own writings and comparisons with the ancient Hindu Rig Veda suggest that he lived even earlier, roughly around 1000 BC, but we'll have to give or take a century. In other words, I suppose we can put it, that Zoroaster probably lived in the late 2nd millennium BCE, perhaps even 1200 BCE, making him a Bronze Age figure rather than an Axial Age 6th century prophet. So by contrast, some Greek authors in antiquity assigned fantastically old dates to Zarathustra. Of course they would. The Greeks sometimes, especially Herodotus and earlier writers, seem to blow things out of proportion a little bit. One Greek historian, for example, Xanthus of Lydia, claimed that Zoroaster lived 6,000 years before Xerxes' invasion of Greece. One philosopher, Plutarch, wrote that Zoroaster lived 5,000 years before the Trojan War. Now, I'm sure your eyebrows raised somewhat. The ancient estimates were clearly not historical, but they reflect mythic chronology or perhaps a misunderstanding. The consensus of modern scholarships leans towards Zoroaster being much older than 600 BC, but 1000 BC seems to stay the reasonable estimate. Now, as for where he lived, the clues point to eastern Iran or perhaps Central Asia. His hymns mentioned places and rivers that fit the region of ancient Bactria, Sogdia, or Khorasmia, around modern Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, or Uzbekistan. The dialect of the Avesta, Zoroastrian scripture, is an Eastern Iranian language, reinforcing this geographic context. Later Persian legends sometimes place Zoroaster in western Iran, at the time Media or Azerbaijan, but those are considered a little less reliable. So, for the sake of continuity, envision Zoroaster as an Eastern Iranian holy man, wandering among herding tribes on the Central Asian steppes. Of course, we've mentioned that we lack written records from Zoroaster's own lifetime, but later Zoroastrian texts preserve legendary accounts of his early life. These stories, though recorded many centuries afterwards in Middle Persian, also called Pahlavi books, paint a pretty dramatic picture of a child destined for greatness, a prodigy. According to these later traditions, extraordinary omens surrounded Zoroaster's birth. It is said that his mother, Dugdova, glowed with an uncanny light before giving birth, as if fire radiated from her body. When the child was born, the first thing he did was laugh out loud, an astonishing laugh, instead of a cry of a newborn. The priests explain this marvel by saying that the archangel Vohu Mana, good mind, entered the infant at birth and filled him with divine joy. Of course, such a prestigious child frightened the evil forces at the time. A local sorcerer named Durasrav is said to have been alarmed by the child's laughter, fearing that this child would grow up and destroy the demonic powers he wielded. And so, Durasrav and another wicked priest, Bratrakresh, became arch-enemies of the infant Zoroaster. The legends describe how these evildoers persuaded Zoroaster's own father to attempt to kill the child, but each attempt failed miraculously. For example, the baby Zoroaster was left in a fire, yet he came out completely unharmed by the flames. On another occasion, he was placed in the path of stampeding cattle, and later among wild horses, but neither the oxen or the horses would trample over him. In another vivid tale, The infant was abandoned in a den of hungry she-wolf whose cubs had been killed so that the furious wolf might devour the child. But instead, divine intervention came and saved him. The archangel Vohumana caused Zoroaster to smite the she-wolf, and a gentle ewe was sent to the cave to nurse the child. When his mother came searching, she found that her child was alive and suckling on the ewe safe and sound. These are pretty miraculous stories, don't you think? The laughing baby, the thwarted assassination attempts, the wolf that did not dare eat him. All of it established Zoroaster in legend as a protected figure chosen by the divines. Scholars note that such motives, an evil king or priest tries to kill a special child who is saved by miracles, well, they're pretty common in myths of great founders and prophets around the world. You'll see a lot of it. Well, the Zoroastrian version likely developed over centuries of oral storytelling before being written down in the 9th century CE. While these tales are not historical facts, in fact we can't really prove them, they are important in understanding how later devotees perceived the prophet as someone marked from birth by a divine mission, surviving against all the odds. And we should keep in mind a bit of the bias of these sources, Pahlavi texts compiled by Zoroastrian priests long after Zoroaster's time, full of hagiography, this saintly legend. They provide a lot of drama and color. But perhaps I'll leave it up to you as to how literally you're going to take them. Let's not ruin the fun. Well, now we get to the real juicy part of the story, the divine revelation at age 30. Setting aside legend and returning to what we can glean from earlier sources, we find that Zoroaster is now a young adult, following his father's profession as a priest. For the first few decades of his life, he likely performed rituals and worshipped the traditional gods of his people. Pretty normal. Nothing interesting yet. But then, at the age of 30, everything changed. Zoroastrian tradition, and later scripture, holds that Zoroaster had a profound divine vision at about 30 years old. He encountered Ahura Mazda, the wise lord, who would eventually become the one single god of Zoroastrianism. One account says Zoroaster was participating in a purification ritual in a river when a shining being, the archangel Vohumana, appeared and led him into the presence of Ahura Mazda and 5 other radiant divine figures, the Amesha Spentas. In this moment, Zoroaster received a revelation of a new religious truth. He realized that Ahura Mazda was indeed the supreme creator, the source of all goodness, and that many, quote, gods, unquote, that the people worshipped were either lesser beings or in some cases even demons who would just trick the people into worshipping them. Of course, this was a radical departure from the prevailing polytheism. Armed with this revelation, Zoroaster felt compelled to preach his truth, Asha, in his language, to all the people he could find. He believed he was appointed as a messenger of Ahura Mazda, to guide others onto the right and noble path. However, prophets often face a bit of resistance in their homelands, and Zoroaster was not going to be an exception. He soon discovered that telling people that their old gods were false and that there was only really one true god, Ahura Mazda, was not really a way to win friends. According to Zoroaster's own hymns, the Gathas, when he first started teachings, his words fell on deaf ears. His fellow countrymen did not listen, and the ones who were on the other spectrum were openly hostile. In one verse, Zoroaster laments his solitude and lack of resources. "I know wherefore I am lacking in vigor, O wise one. It is on the account of the scantiness of my cattle stock, and because I am one of few men only." Now, just to explain it, in this line he notes two problems. One was he was poor, which is a big problem. He had very few cattle, which was a measure of wealth, and he had very few followers. We can imagine Zoroaster as let's say a lonely reformer, perhaps seen as a trouble-making upstart by the established priestly class, who are called Karpans in his text. Indeed, Zoroaster, his teachings threatened the livelihood and the traditions of the existing order of priests and chiefs. Some of these old priests, whom Zoroaster labels as Karpans and Kavis, derogatory terms in the Gathas, by the way, strongly opposed him, because of course they would. There are hints in the Gathas that certain powerful figures publicly denounced Zoroaster. Later sources identify some of these opponents by name. For example, an antagonist named Grahma or Grakma is mentioned, accused of promoting wrong rituals that destroy the truth being Diana in their language. Another named Bendva is noted as a wealthy man who supports a, quote, deceitful teacher leading people astray. It seems Zoroaster's reforms, perhaps condemning the excessive ritualism, animal sacrifices, and the use of the hallucinogenic Haoma drink, angered the traditional priests who benefited from these rituals. But beyond theology, there were likely economic interests at play too. Zoroaster favored the poor and righteous over the rich and corrupt, and that upset the social hierarchy. So, as tradition claims, for about 10 years, Zoroaster struggled to win converts in his homeland. In fact, the early records say only one person initially accepted his message. That was his cousin, Madioi Manna. Apart from this cousin and perhaps a few family members, Zoroaster was one of few men only on his side. Facing growing hostility from all sides, Zoroaster eventually left his home in search of a more receptive audience. And that was the turning point. The prophet Zoroaster became essentially a religious exile on one hand, and a missionary on the other. And so, Zoroaster's fortunes changed dramatically when he found patronage under a local king. He traveled until he reached the court of King Vishtaspa. Vishtaspa was a chieftain or king in a region of eastern Iran, possibly Bactria. This encounter likely occurred after many years of wandering, when Zoroaster was no longer a young man but in his 40s. Winning over a king was crucial. It could provide protection and even a platform for wider acceptance of the religion. But conversion of a king was no simple task. Zoroastrian texts and later legends describe it as a high-stakes drama. At first, King Vishtapa's court was skeptical of the stranger preaching a new faith. The established priests and wise men of the court viewed Zoroaster as a threat. According to later accounts, they subjected Zoroaster to debates and trials. For 3 days, Zoroaster answered rapid-fire questions about his doctrine in front of the king and a council of learned priests. He held firm to his message of one god, Ahura Mazda, and the rejection of the old gods, whom he labeled devas, or demons. The debates were intense, and mostly hostile from the other side, as the court sages tried to find contradictions or heresy in Zoroaster's words. But after this examination, the vested interests at court were not satisfied. high priests felt their power threatened and conspired to sabotage the prophet's influence. One popular legendary account from later tradition relates that these jealous priests accused Zoroaster of performing magic and treason, a sorcerer, a charlatan and a trickster. They convinced the king that Zoroaster was dangerous, and as a result, King Vishtaspa had Zoroaster thrown in prison and subjected to harsh conditions. The prophet was put in chains, given minimal food and water, 31 tortures in all, according to one text. But remarkably, it is said that Zoroaster withstood all of his torments without any pain or harm, protected by his divine patron, Ahura Mazda. These trials in prison further convinced King Vishtaspa that Zoroaster was no ordinary man. The decisive miracle, however, involved the king's beloved horse. As the story goes, the king's favorite horse suddenly became paralyzed, all 4 legs mysteriously frozen. The court priests failed to cure the animal, and desperation grew. Thus, Zoroaster offered a deal. He would heal 1 leg of the horse for each wish or condition the king fulfilled. Well, the king didn't have much of a choice, didn't he? May as well try. So he agreed. For the first leg, Zoroaster asked that the king accept Ahura Mazda and the new faith. The second condition was that the king's son also embrace Zoroaster's teachings. The third was that the queen do the same. The fourth and final condition was dramatic. Zoroaster demanded that the evil priests who had slandered him be executed. That escalated quickly, didn't it? With each agreement, one of the horse's legs was healed. I'm sure the evil priests watching on were getting increasingly nervous. When all conditions were met and the corrupt priests taken care of, the horse stood up, fully cured. King Vishtaspa was astonished, and now he was completely convinced of Zoroaster's divine power and truthfulness. Moved by this miracle, Vishtaspa publicly declared his conversion to the religion of the worship of Ahura Mazda. Whether this exact sequence happened or not, the essence is that Zoroaster finally gained a royal patron, and that is a big deal. Historically, we know from Zoroaster's own Gathas that Vishtaspa, referred to as Kavi, meaning king, was indeed a patron and a follower. Vishtaspa's name is praised as a righteous supporter in Zoroastrian scripture. With the king and queen on his side, Zoroaster's faith now had the backing of political power. Vishtaspa's court, including nobles like Jamaspa, the king's relatives and ministers, also Frashaustra, also converted and became devout supporters. In fact, Zoroaster forged family alliances here. He got married, too, to one of Frashaustra's daughters in some accounts, and he gave his own daughter in marriage to Jamaspa. By becoming kin to the king's closest advisors, Zoroaster had cemented his influence. The remaining years of Zoroaster's life were spent in Vishtaspa's domain, organizing the new community of believers. With royal endorsement, the prophet's teachings spread among the people. The kingdom likely underwent a religious reformation, turning away from the old polytheistic cults and embracing the worship of Ahura Mazda. According to later sources, Vishtaspa's realm even had to fight wars against neighboring peoples who resisted this religious change. An epic struggle is described between Vishtaspa's people, now Zoroastrian, and the hostile Turanian tribes under a leader named Arjasp, who remained loyal to the old gods, and we can't have that, can't we? Zoroaster, though, by now an elderly spiritual leader, purportedly encouraged Vishtaspa's armies and prophesied their victory. And so, after a life of preaching, controversy, and finally triumph in spreading his doctrine. How did the story of Zoroaster really end? Well, no one really knows for sure. The sources again diverge between legend and likelihood. Zoroastrian tradition holds that Zoroaster lived to the age of 77 and met a violent end in a final attack on Vishtaspa's land. An enemy raider, sometimes identified as that sorcerer Bratrokresh from his childhood, infiltrated the sanctuary where Zoroaster was tending the sacred fire. This attacker murdered Zoroaster in cold blood while he was praying, killing him right there on the spot. Thus, in the lore, Zoroaster becomes a martyr, dying in defense of his faith. However, it's interesting that unlike some other religions, Zoroastrians did not traditionally observe a mourning holiday for Zoroaster's martyrdom. This fact has led some scholars to suggest that perhaps Zoroaster did not die a dramatic martyr's death, but rather passed away peacefully in old age. I hope for Zoroaster's sake it was certainly that way. Had his death been a pivotal, tragic event, we might expect annual commemorations, don't you think? The absence of early, widespread martyr traditions does raise the possibility that the tale of being slain by an enemy could be a later embellishment, a fitting, heroic end, added as a footnote to his biography. But in any case, by the time of his death, whether it was by natural causes or extreme blunt force trauma, Zoroaster had laid the foundation for a religion that would endure for a millennia. It still does in some places. I'll get to that later. He left behind disciples, including his own children. Zoroastrian texts say that Zoroaster had 3 sons and 3 daughters, who likely carried on his lineage and faith. The faith of Zoroastrianism, or the good religion, as believers called it, would soon spread across the Iranian plateau. So before moving on to discuss Zoroaster's teachings in detail, let's pause and consider some of the sources we have for his life, because it's very, very important that we do so. Much of the biography we recounted, the Vishtaspa story, the miracles, etc., comes from the later religious texts, compiled long after Zoroaster. This isn't unique to Zoroastrianism. This happens quite a lot in a lot of religious figures, but we still need to mention it. And these include parts of the Avesta, completed in written form during the Persian Empire or later, and Pahlavi books, written in the early medieval period, 9th, 10th century CE, that gathered our older oral traditions together and finally put pen to paper. These sources obviously have a devotional bias. They want to glorify the prophet and show divine validation of his mission, and that's why we see so many miracles and cosmic interventions. In contrast, the primary sources closest to Zoroaster are the Gathas, 17 hymns believed to be composed by Zoroaster himself. The Gathas are embedded in the Avesta and are poetically dense and elusive. They don't narrate events like a history book, rather they're pretty much meditations, prayers, and sermons. Through them, Zoroaster addresses Ahura Mazda, pleads for help against his foes, and celebrates the friends who support him. We extracted clues from the Gathas, like mentions of Vishtaspa and hostility from the Karpans, to sketch these rough events of his life. As we said at the start of the video, we do our best with what we have. The Gathas, being primary, are more reliable about Zoroaster's ideas than the later legends, but they require interpretation. By critically comparing these various sources, the hymns, the primary sure, but a little bit cryptic, and the later narratives, which are detailed but somewhat idealized, we just have to attempt to reconstruct Zoroaster's life and message in the best way that we can. I think we did a decent job of it. Now, having followed Zoroaster's journey from birth to death, let's explore what he taught that was so revolutionary. Of course, he had to have some good ideas if they caught on, right? What did he preach that won him so many devoted followers and also bitter enemies? The teachings and philosophy of Zoroaster. His teachings mark a turning point in the history of religion and spirituality. He's often credited as one of the first, if not the first, monotheist, and as a pioneer of moral dualism. So let's unpack the key elements of his philosophy as gleaned from the Gathas and the other earlier texts, always noting that these were later understood and sometimes expanded by his followers. The first is one God above all, Ahura Mazda. That is the core of Zoroaster's message. This worship of Ahura Mazda meaning the wise Lord. In an age when his contemporaries worshipped a pantheon of gods, Zoroaster elevated Ahura Mazda as the supreme and singular creator. He taught that Ahura Mazda is the source of all that is good, the creator of the heavens and the earth. This god was not distant or indifferent. No, Ahura Mazda is depicted as being part of perfect wisdom and justice, and he interacts with humanity through revelation. Zoroaster didn't necessarily deny the existence of other spiritual beings, but he did insist that only those aligned with Ahura Mazda's goodness were worthy of reverence. Lesser gods, as in the old Indo-Iranian deities, who he called devas, meaning demons or false gods, were to be rejected if they embodied evil or lied. In Zoroaster's view, many of the traditional gods followed the lie and were thus unworthy of worship. Instead of a pantheon of competing gods, Zoroaster presented a kind of heavenly hierarchy under the one god. Ahura Mazda works through a host of abstract divine qualities, later personified as the Amesha Spentas, meaning the holy immortals. In the Gathas, Zoroaster often refers to concepts like Asha, the truth or right order, Vohumana, good mind, and Shastra, dominion, as both virtues and divine presences. Eventually, these came to be seen as archangel-like figures, I suppose, emanations of Ahura Mazda, manifestations of different qualities. For example, Asha Vahishta is the highest truth and righteousness. Vohumana is the good mind that inspires good thoughts. Spenta Armaiti embodies holy devotion or serenity. These are 7 of the key divine aspects, including also Angra Mainyu, the Holy Spirit of Ahura Mazda, Haurvatat, wholeness, perfection, and Amaretat, immortality. Zoroaster taught these represent both Ahura Mazda's nature and virtues that humans should cultivate. Pretty important stuff. Notably, this ties to the divine realm, that to the ethical realm too. The same qualities that divine God, truth, good thinking, righteousness, are expected of normal everyday human beings, an emulation of the highest order. A scholar neatly summarizes, the gods and humankind are both bound to observe the same ethical principles, and it was profoundly an ethical religion, not just a set of rituals. In Zoroaster's theology, God is good, and nothing evil comes from Ahura Mazda. But this raises a classic question, don't you think? If God is wholly good, what is the origin of evil in the world? Zoroaster's answer introduces the second major pillar of his teaching, the concept of dualism, between good and evil. Zoroaster preached that the world is a battlefield of sorts, in a spiritual sense. Asha, truth, order, and good, and Druj, the lie, chaos, and evil, are always at each other's throats. He personified this conflict in two primal forces, or spirits. In a famous passage from the Gathas, he describes how two primal spirits were revealed to him, one benevolent and one malevolent. These twin forces are sometimes called Angra Mainyu, the bounteous spirit representing the good, pretty much the creative spirit of Ahura Mazda, and Angra Mainyu, the hostile or destructive spirit, pretty much representing everything that's evil. Just think of God and the devil. It's kind of like that. The same sort of idea. Good guy, bad guy. Later texts would name Angra Mainyu as Ahriman, the evil one. Zoroaster teaches that each human being, indeed each soul, must choose which of these spirits to follow. As one translation of Yasna 30, a Gothic hymn, puts it, "Hear with your ears the best things. Reflect with a clear mind, each one for himself, upon the two choices of decision, being alert to declare yourselves for the right side before the great judgment." If we put it into other words, we're presented with the fundamental choice of morals, to ally with the good spirit or to ally with the evil spirit. Of course, this is an exercise of free will, another crucial aspect of Zoroaster's philosophy. A later summary of his doctrine says that from the beginning, the good and evil spirits were free to choose life or not life. The good chose life. The evil chose not life. By this act of choice, the universe got split into two camps, the kingdom of justice and truth, and the kingdom of the lie, the Druj. Zoroaster identified Ahura Mazda with the good spirit and Ahriman with the evil one, though intriguingly, in Zoroaster's original hymns, Angra Mainyu is not given equal status to Ahura Mazda. He is a powerful hostile spirit, sure, but not an independent god. Later tradition made them more on dualistic equal terms. The important point for Zoroaster was that evil was a choice. It's the result of a spirit choosing the wrong path, and likewise humans commit evil by choosing the worst purpose instead of the righteous path. The Devas, demons who were actually the old pagan gods, are said to have not chosen rightly. They were deceived by the evil spirit and rushed into fury and violence. Humans must avoid that fate by choosing the truth. This cosmic dualism was not an eternal stalemate in Zoroaster's view. Goodwill can ultimately triumph over evil. Zoroaster taught a hopeful eschatology. There will be a great requital, or judgment, where those who chose good will be rewarded, and those who chose evil will face the consequences. He spoke of a final renewal of the world, when all wrong things are finally righted. In the Gathas, he describes how at the end of time, the worst existence shall be for the wicked, the house of best purpose shall be for the just man. Here we see a clear reference to a form of heaven and hell. The just, who embodied good purpose and truth, will enjoy the house of best purpose, essentially paradise, in the presence of Ahura Mazda, while the wicked, those who embraced the lies and harmed others with the Druj, will experience the worst, miserable fate, which Zoroastrian texts later equate with a hellish condition. This was, as you can see, a moral universe. Your choices in life directly determine what happens after it. In fact, one of Zoroaster's most interesting concepts was his final idea of a victory over evil. He did not preach an eternal dualism of two co-equal gods locked in conflict forever. Rather, evil is powerful but ultimately temporary. In later Zoroastrian doctrine, elaborating on Zoroaster's ideas, History is divided into two epochs, and at the end of the current age, evil will be completely destroyed by Ahura Mazda's power. A savior figure, called the Seoshant, meaning future benefactor, who according to tradition will be a future-born descendant of Zoroaster, will lead humanity in the final battle against falsehood, resurrect the dead, and renew creation, making it perfect and deathless. Zoroaster himself set this expectation that truth would ultimately win, giving his followers both a personal ethical directive along with a cosmic hope to cling to. And so, with the spiritual stage set, one good god, one evil god, and the humans in between with free will, Zoroaster began to drill down to everyday ethics. How does one act in a good manner? The fundamental ethical principle of Zoroastrianism can be summed up in the simple motto: good thoughts, good words, good deeds. This phrase in the Avestan language, humata, hukta, huvashta, is a later slogan, but it pretty much sums up Zoroaster's teachings. To align with Ahura Mazda, the good spirit, a person must discipline their mind, speech, and actions toward goodness. Zoroaster emphasized truthfulness, charity, justice, and the reverence for creation. He also condemned the lies and ritual excesses of the corrupt priests, urging sincerity and religiosity instead. Caring for the cattle and tilling the land was considered meritorious, whereas violence, theft, and deceit were abominations, allied with the evil spirit, and you don't want to be on Angra Mainyu's side. One aspect of Zoroaster's ethics is how positive and life-affirming it is. In contrast to some ascetic or world-renouncing religious leaders, Zoroaster did not ask his followers to withdraw from the world. Instead, he taught that life is a blessing. In fact, Spenta Mainyu literally means bounteous or increasing spirit, and that enjoying the good things of creation, as long as one does so righteously, is just all part of the divine plan. Farming, raising healthy children, and prospering through honest work were seen as fulfilling the will of Ahura Mazda. The only caveat was to do these things justly and with a pure heart. Zoroaster also reformed religious ritual practices to reflect his new theology. The old Indo-Iranian religion involved animal sacrifices, but it seems that Zoroaster put less emphasis on blood offerings. Though later Zoroastrians did practice some sacrifices, the Gathas themselves don't glorify animal sacrifice. Instead, they had a different symbol, one that is a lot cooler. Fire. That became a central figure in Zoroastrian worship. It was seen as the symbol of Asha, the truth and light of Ahura Mazda. Zoroaster likely encouraged the veneration of fire, not as a deity, but as a pure element representing God's presence. He also sanctified the elements of nature, as earth and water, and especially fire, were to be kept pure. This also gave rise to practices like maintaining sacred fires in temples and ritual prayers facing a source of light. Zoroastrians to this day pray in the presence of a fire, a tradition that could be traced back to Zoroaster's emphasis on inner and outer purity. Another reform attributed to Zoroaster is the discouragement of the ritual use of that hallucinogenic hauma, known as soma in India, by the way, which is where they got, I'm sure you've read Aldous Huxley's work, Brave New World. Soma is the, not the hallucinogen, rather the, kind of like the opioid that they take in that book. It's not a good thing. So this hauma was a sacred drink offered to the gods and consumed by priests in the old religion. Zoroaster's silence or negative hints about the Halma cult, which may have involved trance and possibly sacrifice, suggest that he was trying to steer people away from what he saw as superstitious at best and demonic at worst. Instead, prayer, ethical living, and symbolic offerings like the burning of incense or the sacred fire took precedence. Zoroaster also taught about the afterlife in ethical terms. He introduced the idea of a judgment for each soul after death. Upon death, a person's soul would cross the Chinvat bridge, that bridge of judgment. If you'd lived righteously, the bridge would be wise and easy to cross, leading you to the abode of song, a heaven of eternal bliss. But if you had been wicked, if you were on the naughty list, the bridge would become as narrow as a razor's edge, and you would fall into the house of lies, a hellish realm of eternal torment. Which one do you want to go to? However, unlike some later doctrines of eternal hell, Zoroaster's followers believed these punishments or rewards were not necessarily forever. They were part of the cosmic drama until the final resolution. In the end, when evil is destroyed, even the damned would be purified and reunited in a restored world. Now it is worth noting just how just and optimistic Zoroaster's moral vision was for its time. This is really something incredible. He essentially taught that everyone, regardless of their social status, has the ability and responsibility to choose good, and that in the eyes of God, a humble, truthful person of any status is far superior to a powerful liar. This was a challenge to the old order, and it was perhaps where a lot of the nobility and priesthood automatically conferred spiritual goodness. Zoroaster turned that on its head. Asha, the truth, righteousness, that was the only standard now. And even a poor cattle herder could be an exemplar of virtue, while a wealthy priest could be in league with demons if he was corrupt. Zoroaster's philosophy also encompasses a kind of cosmology, an understanding of the world's creation and the role of humans within it. He taught that Ahura Mazda created the world as essentially good, furnishing it with all that we need to live well, that being the water, the sun, plants, animals useful to man, if cattle, dogs, etc., and of course, plenty of good humans to take care of his creation. And everything in creation belongs either to the good side or the evil side. For example, useful, beneficent animals like dogs, cows, and birds were considered creatures of Ahura Mazda, while harmful creatures like snakes, ants, and in one extreme case water rats were seen as a spawn of evil, Angra Mainyu. This led Zoroastrians to practice ritual purity laws. One should not pollute water or fire, which are sacred elements, and one should dispose of corpses in a way that doesn't defile the pure elements, hence the practice of sky burial, leaving bodies to be consumed by vultures, originated to avoid contaminating the earth or fire with decay. Fighting evil included practical aspects, like killing destructive pests, considered creations of Ahriman, the other name for Angra Mainyu. Every aspect of life thus became morally charged, from how you farmed to how you maintained cleanliness and order. So you see, humans in Zoroaster's view are allies of Ahura Mazda, and they're all in the fight, together against chaos. By choosing good thoughts, good words, and good deeds, a person literally helps Ahura Mazda in the cosmic struggle to give him strength. Conversely, when someone lies, cheats, or destroys unjustly, Angra Mainyu gets stronger, This gives human life immense dignity and responsibility. We're not just playthings of capricious gods. We're all soldiers in a moral war with genuine freedom to choose our side and genuine consequences. Zoroaster even saw the potential for humans to achieve spiritual excellence by aligning with the Amesha, the divine virtues. In a sense, a person who embodies the good mind, truth, and devotion in life becomes godlike in themselves. It's pretty remarkable how rational and ethical Zoroaster's religion was compared to many of its contemporaries. And to be honest, it sounds pretty good. Maybe we should bring it back in full force. Sacrifice and ritual took a back seat to the moral state of the individual. Prayer in Zoroastrianism often takes the form of affirmations of faith and pledges to good conduct, rather than just praise or requests. For instance, Zoroastrian confession of faith includes the lines, "I profess myself a worshipper of Mazda, a follower of Zarathustra, opposing the Devas, accepting the Ahuric doctrine." It's a conscious choice being declared. Because Zoroaster's teachings were oral, as well was pretty much everything in that era, they were memorized and passed down by disciples. Over time they were written in the Avesta, and then translated and interpreted by priests. As with any long-transmitted tradition, there's going to be evolutions and accretions. Centuries later, in the era of the Persian Achaemenid Empire, that being 550 to 330 BCE, Zoroastrianism likely changed somewhat from what Zoroaster directly taught. But it seems that the core was still intact. Intriguingly, the Persian kings like Darius, Xerxes, and others mention Ahura Mazda prominently in their royal inscriptions, indicating that Zoroaster's god had become the chief deity of the realm. However, by the later Achaemenid period, the Persians also acknowledged other gods alongside Mazda, that being Mithra and Anaita, showing that strictly monotheistic Zoroastrianism had shifted towards a more inclusive worship, no doubt under royal influence. But even so, the spirit of Zoroaster's reforms, focusing on truth, moral dualism, and Ahura Mazda's supremacy, continued to guide the Persians for some time to come. So to conclude our talk on who was Zoroaster, I suppose we can sum it up like this. He was a religious innovator who courageously challenged the norms of his society. He transformed the religion of ancient Iran from a polytheistic nature-worshipping one to focus on one transcendent God and the ethical struggle between good and evil, and in doing so, he became one of the first figures in history to articulate ideas of moral dualism, judgment after death, heaven and hell, and the eventual triumph of good, concepts that have become cornerstones of many religions today. Historically, his teachings have become a guiding light of the mighty Persian civilization, and later influenced thinkers and prophets beyond Persia's borders. Spiritually, his emphasis on personal righteousness, truth, and the constant choice between good and evil gives his message a timeless and universal quality. Unlike mythic heroes, Zoroaster was a real person, and most scholars do agree on his historicity. Yet around him has grown a rich tapestry of myth and devotion. And that's why we've had to examine these sources critically, recognizing where they serve religious purposes and where they might preserve a kernel of historic truth. The biases of later priests didn't stop us from seeing the essence, and that's a man of deep conviction who experienced what he believed was communion with the divine and set out to bring a new enlightenment to humanity. Today, the number of Zoroaster's followers is pretty small, but his legacy is far larger than the Zoroastrian community itself. It lives on in the cultural memory of humanity. We see it in literature, from ancient Greek texts to modern writings, in art as illustrated by Raphael's Renaissance fresco where Zoroaster holds the celestial globe, right up there next to Aristotle and Plato, by the way, and in ongoing academic interest. You're watching this now, aren't you? And scholars still study the Gathas in Avesta to tease out the authentic voice of Zoroaster, still marveling at how a Bronze Age poet could conceive such advanced theological ideas. And so, in closing, Zoroaster's life story, once properly introduced as we have done, is as dramatic and inspiring as that of any religious founder. A lone prophet who laughed in the face of danger bravely, preached truth to power, converted kings through wisdom and miracles, and envisioned a future where the world was perfected by goodness. All that makes him a figure of endless fascination. Who was Zoroaster? I suppose we can answer. He was the messenger of Mazda, the man who changed the Persian religion, the teacher whose influence stretched across continents and era, a voice that still speaks to us today through echoes as we find in later faiths, and the continuing devotion of those who still call themselves Zoroastrians. In a very real sense, the fire that Zoroaster lit in the world never really died out, as the flame of conscience, urging humanity towards good thoughts and good words and good deeds. And there you have it. I hope you thought that was an informative talk on Zoroaster. We're going to be doing a bit more on Zoroastrianism. Our next video will be the golden age of Zoroastrianism, which I'm sure you're looking forward to. But for now, I'm going to thank my top tier patrons: Dark, Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Legitmus, Carrie, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfidnir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Stark Factory, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Video Man, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HMSHH, and Crystal, and Talvery. Thank you very much. And I will see you whenever you feel like coming back, I suppose. Well, I hope you all have a good night, rest well, and as always, lots of love to you all, and remember, good words, good thoughts, good deeds. Regardless of what you believe, you can't argue with that. See you next time, everyone.